Auteur, meaning author, argues that good directors are the most important part of the filmmaking process. Auteurs have a unique way of making films and have a distinct voice, and their films can be identified through their style, story, and their subject matter. This is Andrew Saris. Saris said, "The critic can never assume that a bad director will always make a bad film. No, not always, but almost always, and that is the point." He argues that the theory is not 100% solid, but yet he still argues for it. Saris argued these three main premises of the auteur theory. An auteur must have technical competence, a coherent recognizable style, and an interior meaning. Technical competence. This is how cinematically inclined a director is. If the director can prove themselves artistically by using film, then they are an auteur. Good directors can make themselves recognizable just by the way their films are made. Coherent recognizable style. Directors who have a recurring style or characteristics in their films are more likely to be auteurs. Auteurs can express their views on the world and their feelings and thoughts through cinema. Interior meaning. An auteur's personal experiences shape their films and the interior meaning of their films. There is always a recurring theme throughout an auteur's film. For example, every single Quentin Tarantino film has a recurring theme of revenge or redemption. This is from a personal experience he had with his mother. Since his fame, he has not given his mum any money. This is due to an altercation he had in his childhood with his mum. This is an example of a personal experience that has affected and shaped all of Tarantino's films. Francois Truffaut. He argued against the dislike of American films. Truffaut believed that there was some sense of artistry in American films. A lot of Europeans at the time disliked American films. They believed that American films and Hollywood system created low art and rushed, mass-produced, pointless films. A lot of European films at the time were art films, as films had not really acclimatized to American style or agendas yet. These European films were adaptations of novels and poems, and they were grounded, with not a lot of action or clear purpose. They were aimed at critics. However, during the Nazi occupation of France, all American films were banned, meaning all audiences in France were stuck with European films. When France was freed and the war was over, the floodgates were opened, and American films were reintroduced to Europe. They were welcomed with open arms, as the French had gotten bored of all the art films. They wanted some more Americanized films that were not always grounded in reality. Genre theory. Genre is a French word and it means type or kind. Genre is referring to multiple films that share the same characteristics or narrative conventions or styles. Genre is ever evolving and will never truly be set in stone. For example, Western films used to just be cowboys, but then Star Wars came along, and it is basically a Western in space. Genre expectations. Genres provide audiences with a certain expectation, and they also give auteurs and directors a certain guide that they can follow. However, just like genres, expectations can also evolve. A great example of this is horror. Expectations for horrors used to just be monsters in far-off lands and mansions. People died, the hero kills a monster. Then it changed to serial killers in your own neighborhoods, and then it changed to murderers that were your own friends and family. And even now, horror is still evolving. Narrative conventions. Films of the same genre will have certain character types, like in horror films having the final girl. They also have similar plot events and narrative patterns. Films of the same genre also have similar locations. For example, westerns are always set in outbacks and deserts. Star Wars is partially set in the fictional desert planet Tatooine. And here is an example of two films having the same narrative conventions. Thematic conventions. Films of the same genre will have the same or similar themes. Rom-coms feature recurring themes, such as the eccentric best friend, the unexpected love interest, and the near breakup. However, they always end up living happily ever after. Narrative. Narrative means storytelling. Narrative films are films that tell a story. However, not every story has a narrative. Documentaries, for example, do not have a narrative. The terms story and plot always get confused. This is malapropism. Story is chronological events happening from the beginning to the end, whereas the plot is the narrative events happening as they would play out in the film. An example of this would be flashback scenes. If you were to describe the story, the flashback scene would be the first scene. If you were to describe the plot, then the flashback scene would be in the middle of the film, or wherever the scene plays out in the film. It's a bit confusing, but this is how it makes sense to me. The story of F. Scott Fitzgerald is tragic. He is like Van Gogh in the same sense that they both believed themselves to be failures until after their deaths, when people recognized them as geniuses. The first edition of Tender is the Night was considered a commercial failure. F. Scott Fitzgerald kept changing around the events of the book to try and make it make sense as a story. However, nothing worked. What Fitzgerald did not realise is that the first edition of the book does not play out like a story. It plays out like a plot of a film or a screenplay. This is because he sets up an establishing shot and then further explores those characters through the eyes of another character. Storytelling fuel. A good narrative film must have a certain goal for the characters to achieve. This is not always true, however, but for 99% of films it is. A goal could be desire. The character must strive for something for the audience to root for them. However, if the character were to reach their desire or goal, then it would be a short, uninteresting story. Therefore, stories need conflict. Conflict does not have to be something big either, just as long as there is something to push the characters back from achieving their goal. The three act structure. The three act structure is an important structure that is followed in cinema. In the first act, you would set up characters and locations or settings, then you begin to set up the rest of the film and situations the characters will find themselves in. The second act is where the characters try to redeem the situations and resolve any problems. This usually does not work out, and more problems and obstacles are usually created. Then, in the third act, the characters finally manage to resolve any problems and conflicts caused, and then it returns to a sense of normality. A new equilibrium is created. Filmmakers do not have to follow this narrative structure 100%, however, it is a good guideline. Again, going back to Star Wars, George Lucas followed the three-act structure. In Act 1, we were introduced to characters like Luke, Obi-Wan, Han, Leia, Darth Vader, Tarkin, C-3PO, and R2-D2. Planets such as Alderaan, Tatooine, and the Death Star were also introduced. In Act 2, Luke and Obi-Wan have conflict with stormtroopers, and Han has conflict with Jabba the Hutt. The protagonists manage to escape Tatooine and reach Alderaan only to find it destroyed by the Death Star. The midpoint when the characters are at their lowest is when they get dragged into the Death Star by a tractor beam, as they believe they are far away from completing their goal. Aesthetics. Auteurs have their own style, however, in the aesthetics of film, an individual style could surpass them and become its own stylistic format for others to follow. Every single aspect of filmmaking is affected by style. An example of camera work affected by style is in Breaking Bad. For the entire of Breaking Bad, the camera is handheld. It is a very subtle choice and few people notice it, but it is there. Once you notice it, it gives Breaking Bad an almost documentary style feel. It envelops the audience to become part of the action, rather than observers. In some Breaking Bad scenes, characters even interact with the camera, whether they are staring down the camera lens or bumping into the camera. This style envelops the audience. Formalism. The reshaping of reality through the aesthetics of filmmaking and styles used. Editing is used heavily throughout films to create a unique style. Directors who are formalists usually tend to create stories based on individual experiences, and directors' focus is to manipulate audiences emotionally. Hugo Munsterberg is a formalist. Here is a quote. "To picture emotions must be the central aim of the photoplay." Camera. The camera is the main part of cinematography. The meaning behind a shot can easily be changed and manipulated by how it is filmed. Time. The length of shots and the manipulation of frames can change the meaning of a shot. By lengthening a shot, you can invoke a sense of uneasiness or anticipation in the audiences. Typically, the manipulation of the length of a shot is used to slow down footage. Space. Space is important to film, and no, I'm not talking about Star Wars again, but rather the spacing of a shot and how the audience will perceive it. If there are only two camera angles in a scene and they are both close-ups, the audience will not have a good understanding of the space of the location. Camera/height. The height of a camera is important. Eye-level shots are perceived as the norm, as this is what audiences are used to seeing. If the height of the shot is manipulated, it will invoke an emotional reaction within the audience, as this has broken the audience's trust. Camera angles. Angles are important when positioning a shot. Again, level angles and a high level are the norm. Different angles can manipulate the audience's reactions towards certain characters. For example, low angles, when the camera is low down and tilted up towards the subject, give the character or the subject in frame a bigger sense of scale. High angles, when the camera is higher up and looking down at the character or subject, give the character or subject a smaller sense of scale. Dutch angles is when the camera is tilted to the side. This gives audiences an unnerving reaction. Quentin Tarantino has mastered angles. Most of his films feature the famous trunk shot. The trunk shot is a low shot that is first-person view of a character looking up at other characters. Tarantino usually hangs on these shots. Distance. Distancing between characters or subjects and the camera can tell the audience a lot about a character. The most common shot is a mid-shot, where the majority of the camera is in frame. If a wide shot is used, it can distance the character both literally and metaphorically from the audience. If a close-up is used and a low angle is used, it can create a sense of uneasiness in the audiences. Lenses. Cameras perceive the world through their lenses. The lens is the eye of a camera. However, lenses can be changed and swapped out. This lets the camera capture distinctive styles and depth in shots. Lenses change the depth of field of shots. Aspect ratio. The aspect ratio is the width and height of a film. Most films keep the same aspect ratio throughout the entire film. However, some directors, like Christopher Nolan, change aspect ratio throughout the films. In the Dark Knight trilogy, during action scenes, the aspect ratio changes to a wider and shorter aspect ratio. This is a subtle change and audiences will subconsciously notice it and get enticed further by the action. Nolan does this throughout all his films, however, most of the aspect ratio changes are not noticeable as they are made for IMAX screens. People are beginning to experiment with aspect ratio, and some people are even making entire films vertically on their phones. So hopefully, at some point in the future, we will see a whole new variety of films with different aspect ratios. Thank you for watching.